You are 3 days old, and no one has put you down. Not for a nap, not to sleep, not even to cry alone in another room for a minute while someone finishes a chore. Someone is holding you right now, skin against skin, close enough to feel every breath you take, and they have not stopped since the hour you were born. This wasn't just love, not only that anyway. For most of human history, it was survival technology. For roughly 200,000 years, long before incubators, long before car seats, long before a baby ever slept behind a closed door in a room of its own, the line between a child who lived and a child who didn't often came down to one blunt question: how many hands were reaching for that baby? Today, in wealthy countries, more than 99 out of every 100 children born will live to see their 5th birthday. That number feels normal to you. It feels like the baseline of being human. It isn't, it's new. It is barely a flicker at the very end of a very long story. Paleodemographers, researchers who reconstruct patterns of life and death from ancient skeletons, burial grounds, and the growth rings hidden inside old teeth, have spent decades studying how often ancestral children actually survive to adulthood. It's painstaking work, piecing together a population's entire childhood mortality from fragments of bones scattered across a burial ground, but the pattern that emerges from site after site, region after region, is remarkably consistent. Their estimates, drawn from hunter-gatherer and early farming populations across multiple continents, land in a grim range. In many ancestral societies, somewhere close to half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Half. Not from any single cause, not from any single failure. So how did the other half make it? Not through better food alone, not through luck alone, though luck mattered plenty. They made it through a system so effective it left fingerprints on human biology itself, a system anthropologists now call cooperative breeding. Here's what that phrase actually means, stripped of the jargon. In most mammal species, a mother raises her offspring largely by herself. She feeds it, carries it, defends it, and if she cannot manage alone, the offspring usually dies. That is the rule almost everywhere in the animal kingdom. Humans broke it, not by accident and not recently. Somewhere deep in our evolutionary past, our species stumbled onto a different arrangement entirely, one so unusual that for a long time researchers studying other primates almost missed it, because they weren't looking for it. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, don't do this. A chimpanzee mother rarely lets another female so much as touch her infant in its first weeks of life. Humans somehow went the exact opposite direction. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer, HRDY, spent decades studying exactly how we broke it. Drawing on primate behavior and years of fieldwork in human foraging societies, her research argues that human children survived not because mothers were superhuman, but because mothers were never expected to raise a child completely alone in the first place. The math simply didn't work that way. A human child takes close to 2 decades to become fully self-sufficient, longer than almost any other creature on Earth, and no single parent, however devoted, can hunt, gather, defend, and nurse a helpless infant every hour of every day for 20 years straight. So the species outsourced the job. HRDY calls the people who share it alloparents. Allo simply means other. Alloparents are the people who are not a child's biological mother or father, but who still feed it, carry it, soothe it, and protect it almost as if it were their own. Grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, unrelated adults in the same band, bound only by the fact that they live and eat and sleep in the same small group. In many ancestral communities, a single infant might be held, fed, or watched over by 10 or more different people before its first birthday even arrived. 10 sets of eyes, 10 sets of hands, 10 separate people who had to fail at the exact same moment for that baby to be in real danger. Why would evolution favor a setup this complicated? Because on its own, a human infant is, biologically speaking, a terrible idea to raise alone. Human babies are born earlier, relative to how developed their brains still are, than almost any other primate on the planet. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur within hours of birth. A human newborn cannot even hold up its own head. Our skulls are already at the outer limit of what a human pelvis can safely deliver, and our brains are still nowhere close to finished growing. We are, in a very real sense, all born premature. Too demanding, too helpless, too slow to mature for any one exhausted person to manage solo. So the species spread the cost of childhood across the whole group instead. And you can see that pattern preserved almost perfectly in societies that, until quite recently, lived close to how humans lived for most of history. Anthropologist Melvin Connor spent years living among and studying the Jew/Honsi San people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, one of the most thoroughly documented hunter-gatherer populations anywhere in the world. What he found appended a lot of assumptions Western researchers had carried into the field with them. San infants, Connor observed, were almost never set down. They were carried upright, facing outward, in soft slings that kept them in constant physical and visual contact with an adult, hour after hour, day after day. They nursed on demand, sometimes dozens of times across a single day, with no fixed schedule at all. They slept every single night touching another warm body, for years, not months. This wasn't indulgence, and it wasn't a lack of discipline. Connor's research connects that constant contact directly to survival odds in an environment full of predators, illness, and none of the modern medicine you take for granted. A baby who is never alone is a baby who is never unwatched. Every cry gets a response within seconds, not because the culture is soft, but because a delayed response, in that world, could be fatal. And it wasn't only mothers doing the watching. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett studied the Aka people of Central Africa and documented something that genuinely surprised many researchers coming from cultures where fathers were assumed to be distant. Aka fathers, Hewlett found, held their infants for close to half of all daylight hours, among the highest levels of direct paternal contact ever recorded in any human society studied. Think about how far that sits from the old cartoon image of the ancient hunter, gone all day, uninvolved, until his son was old enough to hold a spear. The evidence points somewhere else entirely. In many ancestral societies, fatherhood meant near constant physical presence, not distant provision from a safe distance. Hewlett even documented Aka fathers offering a breast to a fussy infant when the mother wasn't nearby, not to feed the child, since that obviously wasn't possible, but simply to soothe him, the same comforting gesture a mother might use, borrowed by a father who clearly saw calming his child as just as much his job as hers. Grandmothers mattered just as much, if not more. Anthropologist Kristen Hawkes developed what's now known as the grandmother hypothesis, an idea that tries to explain a genuine biological oddity. Human females are among the only creatures on Earth that live for decades after they can no longer reproduce. Most animals simply die not long after their fertility ends. Why would evolution keep a human female alive for 30 or 40 more years, long after her own childbearing days are over? Hawkes' answer, built on years of fieldwork among the Hadza people of Tanzania, is that grandmothers earned their long post-reproductive lives by working. Older women who could no longer have children of their own instead spent their days digging tubers and gathering food for their grandchildren, freeing up mothers to wean their older children sooner and have the next baby earlier, and directly improving the survival odds of every grandchild they helped feed. A grandmother, in this framework, wasn't a retired member of the group, quietly stepping aside once her own children were grown. She was one of the most productive members of the entire band, and her labor may have shaped how long the human lifespan itself evolved to stretch. There's a way to check claims like this against the body itself, not just against behavior anthropologists can watch today. Researchers studying ancient teeth can now use something called isotopic analysis, a technique that reads chemical traces locked inside enamel the way a tree ring records a year of growth. Because breast milk and solid food leave different chemical signatures behind, scientists can tell, tooth by tooth, roughly when a child stopped nursing thousands of years ago. That evidence lines up closely with what HRDY, Connor, and Hawkes all separately concluded from watching living societies. The teeth remember what the bands themselves no longer can. The archaeological record backs all of this up in a place you would least expect to find it, not in how ancestral children were raised, but in how they were buried. At a site called Sungia, in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered a grave roughly 34,000 years old, containing 2 children laid head-to-head, covered in thousands of hand-carved ivory beads, each one estimated to have taken close to an hour of skilled labor to make. Do the math on that. Thousands of beads, thousands of hours, poured into honoring children who likely never lived to see adulthood. Why does that matter to the story of survival? Because grief that elaborate is evidence of investment that elaborate. People do not spend that many collective hours honoring something they didn't consider precious while it was still alive and breathing among them. Consider what that labor actually represents. An entire community in the depths of an ice age, with every hour of daylight needed for hunting, gathering, and simply staying warm, chose instead to spend an almost unimaginable stretch of collective time carving beads for 2 children who were already gone. That choice tells you something the bones alone cannot. It tells you these were not children the group tolerated or merely tended out of obligation. They were children the group had organized itself around, in life, and apparently in death as well. So picture an ordinary day, if a word like ordinary even meant anything to them yet. A woman wakes before dawn, an infant already pressed against her chest in a sling made of softened hide. She did not sleep alone last night, and neither did the baby. Her own mother and her older daughter slept close enough to reach the child if he cried out, close enough that the responsibility for his safety was never resting on one exhausted set of shoulders. By mid-morning, the baby isn't with her at all. His grandmother has taken him, humming low under her breath, while the mother strips plant fiber into cordage nearby, her hands finally free for the first time in hours. An older cousin, maybe 8 years old, is minding a toddler near the fire, letting him bang 2 smooth stones together while the adults process meat from yesterday's hunt, everyone within earshot of everyone else, everyone half listening for a change in the pitch of a cry that would mean something is wrong. By midday, the group has scattered into smaller tasks, but the child hasn't scattered with any one person. He's been passed twice more, once to a young man mending a tool who parks the baby against his knee without breaking his focus, once to another nursing mother who feeds him without a second thought. Because in this world, one lactating woman's milk belongs, in a real sense, to every infant in the band, not just her own. By evening, when the group gathers back around the fire, the baby ends the day exactly where he started it, against his mother's chest, but he has spent hours of that day in at least 4 other pairs of arms, none of them strangers, all of them invested in the same outcome. Tonight he will fall asleep to the sound of several familiar voices instead of one, and if he wakes crying in the dark, more than one body will already be close enough to reach him before he's even fully awake. No single person was responsible for keeping this child alive today. Everyone in camp was, whether they thought about it in those terms or not. If the mother falls ill, the baby does not starve, because another woman nearby is also nursing and can feed him without a second thought. If a predator moves through the edge of camp, a dozen adults respond at once, not one frightened parent alone. If the mother dies, and paleodemographic evidence suggests maternal death in childbirth was tragically common across most of human history, the child still has a real chance, because he was never solely dependent on her survival to begin with. The system was built, deliberately or not, to survive the loss of any single caregiver, including the mother herself. This was not sentimentality. This was infrastructure built slowly over hundreds of thousands of years, and it worked well enough for long enough to carry the entire species through ice ages, migrations, famines, and disasters that would have wiped out a species raising its young any other way. Here is the twist almost no one sees coming. You would assume that as humans grew more technologically advanced, child survival steadily improved with every step forward. Farming, permanent settlements, stored grain instead of unpredictable foraging, surely all of that made life safer for children. In many places, for the first several thousand years, it made things measurably worse. When human groups shifted from foraging to farming, several things changed at once, and not in a child's favor. Populations packed closer together, which let disease spread faster than it ever could across small, mobile foraging bands. Diets narrowed down to a handful of staple crops instead of dozens of wild foods, which often meant nutrition got worse, not better. Permanent settlements meant human and animal waste accumulated near the same water sources people drank from every single day, instead of being left behind with each seasonal move the way foragers had always done. Skeletal evidence from early farming sites across multiple regions of the world shows something researchers did not expect going in. Signs of childhood malnutrition and physical stress, preserved as tiny growth interruptions inside tooth enamel, actually increased in many places after the shift to agriculture, not decreased. Bodies got shorter, on average, in the generations right after farming took hold. Something about that advanced, new lifestyle was quietly harder on a growing child than the old one had been. Researchers comparing skeletons from foraging populations against skeletons from early farming populations in the same regions have repeatedly found the same pattern. The farmers, on average, were shorter, showed more evidence of childhood illness, and had more dental problems than the foragers who came before them, even though the farmers had, in theory, a more reliable food supply sitting in storage nearby. Reliable is not the same as sufficient, and abundant calories from a single crop are not the same as the varied nutrition a forager's diet used to provide almost by default, simply from eating whatever the season offered. There's a deeper mechanism buried in this, too, one that connects straight back to cooperative breeding. Foraging mothers, nursing on demand for years at a time, tend to have longer natural gaps between births, because frequent breastfeeding suppresses fertility on its own without anyone planning it that way. Farming mothers, who could wean children earlier onto soft cooked grains instead of relying on years of nursing, often ended up having children closer together in age. That single shift sounds small. It wasn't. More children, born closer together, spread across the same limited number of caregiving hands. The village of alloparents didn't vanish overnight when farming arrived. Grandmothers, older siblings, and aunts were all still there. But the ratio of children to available caregivers in many early agricultural communities quietly got worse, right at the moment when disease and crowding were also getting worse. A support network built over hundreds of thousands of years to handle a certain rhythm of births suddenly had to stretch across more children, arriving faster, with less individual time to give any single one of them. Agriculture fed more mouths. It solved the problem of famine in years the harvest went well, and that mattered enormously. But for those first difficult generations, on the specific question of keeping any one child alive and thriving, it did not necessarily protect the children attached to those mouths any better than the system it slowly replaced. In some regions, the archaeological evidence suggests it briefly made things worse before it eventually made them better, once denser populations had time to develop their own new solutions to the problems density itself had created. Now look at where that leaves you. If you were raised in much of the modern world, there's a real chance you were raised primarily, maybe almost entirely, by one or two people. A mother, maybe a father, both, quite possibly, exhausted, both working full days, both trying to do completely alone what an ancestral village once spread deliberately across 10 or more sets of hands. Your biology never got the memo that this arrangement changed. It still expects a village. Researchers studying modern parental burnout consistently point to isolation as one of the strongest predictors of parental stress and postpartum depression, not the raw difficulty of childcare tasks themselves, but the sheer aloneness of carrying them. The phrase, "it takes a village," gets repeated so often now that it has curdled into a cliché, easy to nod along to in passing and just as easy to forget. It was never a metaphor to begin with. It was a plain description of the only child-rearing system that ever actually worked reliably for the overwhelming majority of human history. Somewhere in your life right now, there may be an alloparent you've never once thought to name that way, a grandparent who takes the kids every single weekend without being asked twice, a neighbor who watches them for an afternoon so an exhausted parent can just sit down, a friend who shows up with dinner during a hard week no explanation required. A teacher, a coach, an older cousin who texts to check in. These aren't quirky modern conveniences or signs of a family that can't manage on its own. They're the oldest form of childcare our species has ever practiced, quietly resurfacing in whatever shape a modern life still allows it to take, patched together across apartments and time zones instead of a single shared fire. Compare that to the version so many modern parents actually live. A young family moves for a job hundreds or thousands of miles from either set of grandparents. Both parents work full days, then come home to a second full shift of feeding, bathing, and settling a child, with no aunt down the path to hand the baby to for even 20 minutes. Childcare, when it exists at all, is purchased by the hour from a stranger, not woven automatically into the fabric of daily life the way it was for nearly every generation that came before. None of this is a personal failure on any one parent's part. It's a structural one, built into how modern life is organized, and it is asking a single nervous system, or two, to do a job that evolution built for 10. The instinct to reach out for help, instead of white-knuckling it alone in a locked apartment at 3 in the morning, isn't weakness. It was never a failure to cope on your own. It is the single oldest and single most successful parenting strategy your species has ever used. Long before there were parenting books, before there was advice from anyone claiming to be an expert, there was simply this: more hands than one child could ever need, more eyes than any single danger could slip past unnoticed. A quiet, unspoken agreement, repeated in camp after camp for a couple 100,000 years, that no child in the group would ever be only one person's responsibility to keep alive. You inherited the want for that, even if you never inherited the village itself. That's why a crowded holiday table can feel like relief instead of chaos. That's why a grandparent's offer to take the kids for the weekend can feel like more than a favor. Somewhere underneath the modern arrangement of small, separate households, the old instinct is still running, quietly asking for exactly the kind of help your ancestors never had to ask for, because it was simply always there. You are 3 days old, and no one has put you down. That was never just tenderness, even though it looked exactly like tenderness from the outside. It was the reason you, and every single person you have ever loved, made it far enough through childhood to grow up at all.